We had some phenomenal performances, some welcome returns to the podium, and some controversies. Of course, we had that last one. It's the World Tour. But I'm going to talk about as much of that as I possibly can in this week's episode of Beckman's Breakdown, the show where I take a look at all the BWF World Tour events from Super 500 all the way up to 1000, including the majors and the team events. This week was the Denmark Open Super 750, a tournament which historically I have always enjoyed watching, and this year I felt it was the same. Although I must admit, the conditions inside the arena this year were a little strange. Even players like Lokian from Singapore said that the conditions from when he did the practice and before the tournament started and from day one, the difference was huge. The drastic changes between how the shuttles played and how the conditions were was evolving and changing all the time. And you noticed that as the tournament got later and later and the courts got less and less. By the time we got to the semi-finals and finals, where we were down to one court, the conditions were becoming very, very difficult for the players. We saw a number of 3-game matches, and also in the singles events particularly, we saw a number of matches where game one would end up quite close or relatively one-sided, and then the next two would also be one-sided. We saw that especially in the women's singles, and especially from the two players that reached the final, An Seong and Wang Ziyi. I'm sure if you see the scores, I might even put them up on the screen. There were a number of matches where both players either had a very tight or opening game, or they might have lost it, and then they went on to win incredibly easily. It was a mixture of drift and slow shuttles, I think, that caused this. And yes, like I said, the two players in the women's singles final were the ones that obviously had a number of those strange matches. And actually, talking of An Seong, that's where I want to start this week's episode. But quickly, before I get into that, I of course have to do my usual shameless plug of my Beckman's Breakdown merchandise. If you want to purchase any of these, then you can go to the link in the description. I might even pin it in a comment. If you want to go there, there's still, I think, a few items left that can be bought where you have the 20% off, but it is free worldwide shipping. So if you do want to support the channel in another way other than just watching these videos is enough, I do really appreciate that. But if you want to support that a little bit more and you want to get, I think, pretty good t-shirts, they are very good quality, then yes, head over to the link in the description and you can buy your very own Beckman's Breakdown merchandise. But enough of the shameless plug, let's get cracking into this episode. So, like I said, I want to start with An Seong because I think that's one of the big stories. There's one other that I'll get to later. But for me, the big thing when it comes to An Seong, obviously she was able to win this tournament. Going one better than last year. She also meant that by winning this 750, Super 750 in Denmark specifically, she has now completed all of the Super 750. She's won all 6 of those tournaments. And if you add the fact she's won all 4 of the Super 1000s, she's won the World Championships, the Asian Games, and the Olympic Games, she's pretty much completed badminton. I'm not quite sure what events in the Super 500s that she has left to complete. Obviously, there's going to be a few that she probably won't ever play again, but who knows if she might go hunting to try and complete that. Obviously, I don't believe she's won the Asian Championships, and she hasn't won the Sudirman Cup, a team event, but she has been a part of a winning Yuba Cup team. So for the fact that she's only 23 and done so much and now has won all the 750s, and I think she is the first player to do that, that is absolutely incredible. One incredible performance. Also, by winning this Denmark Open, she's become the first Korean or women's singles player to win the Denmark Open in 38 years. Again, she is constantly striving, pushing forward, breaking boundaries, setting records, and creating firsts for her country. She is an absolutely fantastic athlete, and she demonstrated that with the way that she played all the way through the week. I did talk about a little bit there that there was a few odd matches. I think in her quarterfinal against Miyazaki, she lost the opening game relatively comfortably and then won really comfortably. She did the same in a semi-final against Akane Yamaguchi. And it seemed possibly in the final that it was going to go that way, but it wasn't. I'll come back to the final in a second. But before I get into her performances, I specifically want to focus on her semi-final where she beat the world champion Yamaguchi, and obviously in the final where she beat the player that beat her in the final last year, Wang Ziyi. But before I get to any of that, obviously the big thing that stuck out to me is what a difference a year makes. We only have to cast our mind back to the 2024 Denmark Open, and I think the video I did, the Beckman's breakdown, that was a special because it was all about Young, because all the headlines were about her, and not necessarily positive, because obviously the Denmark Open came a couple of months after the Olympics, where she'd won gold, and then she basically blasted the BKA, talking about how how they treated her, how they mistreated her injuries, how they were making her wash up, do the laundry, and all these other archaic things. Obviously, that all came to the forefront. And then what we saw at the Denmark Open, where she was snubbing her coach, she's snubbing Sung Ji-hyun, and I can't quite remember his name, but he was the head coach of Korean badminton at the time. That was obviously dominating the headlines. I think her knee injury wasn't in great shape. She definitely wasn't in great playing shape last year. She was obviously not personally making the headlines for anything too negative, but there was a lot of the story around it. The story around the whole Denmark Open was pretty much all centered around An Se-young and her relationship with not just her coaches, but the BKA. This year, it's like night and day. Not only was she in much better form, obviously she was able to win the tournament, like I said, beating the player that beat her last year, but obviously she is in a much happier, much better position. Her relationship with the coaches, I saw an Instagram story by her, thanking a team, the big team that is behind her. Obviously, the coaches have changed. I know I think Ronnie, who's still behind her coach. Someone mentioned that he's now with the junior team, but I think he's still involved. But obviously, the head coach has changed. It's now Park Ju-bong. The chairman of BK is now Kim Dong-moon. And behind An Se-young's court was also Lee Hyun-il, who was a fantastic men's singles player. So lots of things have changed. And so, like I said, what a difference a year makes. So, yeah, no, absolutely fantastic. I've already gone through what a performance it was, and obviously the records she's broken and the achievements that she's achieved, completing the World Tour Super 750 events, winning all of them. In fact, the Denmark Open was the last one, obviously, that she had to win. She's actually won every single other one, including the French Open, which is going on this week, twice. So maybe she needs to win the Denmark Open again next year to round that all out, then won all the 750s twice. But enough of those achievements. Let's talk a little bit about the actual badminton that she played. And like I said, I want to focus more on the two matches, specifically the semi-final against Yamaguchi and the final against Wang Ziyi. Now, against Yamaguchi, I did see a post-match interview after I'd made notes, obviously after I'd watched it, and it kind of confirmed what I thought that An Se-young changed, because she lost the first game relatively comfortably. I can't quite remember the scores, but then she came back and won very, very comfortably in the second and the third. And for me, the big change was in the first. It was a little bit like what we saw at the Korean Open. Yamaguchi was attacking, playing with lots of variation and lots of confidence. But to be fair, An Se-young was allowing her to do that. She was playing on the slightly faster end, An Se-young, so maybe she was struggling to get her length. So she was hitting a little bit slower, because obviously if you punch through it with the drift, it could carry it. So sometimes not only do players hit short at a faster end, but they tend to hit a little slower too, which is obviously a deadly combination. And Yamaguchi was absolutely flying. She obviously is playing some great badminton herself at the moment. But then obviously after that first game, I think going to the slower end definitely helped An Se-young. But one thing I noticed, and this is what she did in the China Masters when she beat Yamaguchi, was it in the final or even in the semi-final? But she came out far faster was one thing, but more specifically her speed and her push and effort to get onto the front court. Yes, she attacked a little bit more, she attacked more accurately as well, which obviously helps things, but she put a massive shift, a big effort in pushing up the court as fast as she can, taking that shuttle at the front of the court early, which basically does a couple of things. Obviously, one, it allows her to get the attack that little bit more, but two, it didn't allow Yamaguchi to attack, or if it did, she had slightly less time. She was under more pressure, and you could see that Yamaguchi was getting less chances to attack, so when she did, she might be forcing a few, and you could kind of see in Yamaguchi, a little bit like I saw at the China Masters, the belief in her that can she win this slowly drained from her. She was still trying, she was still putting the effort in, but I think the way that An Se-young just took the front court, won that battle. We always talk about the front court battle in singles, and I spoke of this at length when I was commentating at the BXL, but it isn't just a straightforward, like, you just take the early net. or you just get the attack. Sometimes it can be other layers, like it stops your opponent from just being slightly more unbalanced to attack, or it allows you to be better balanced in defense and or have more options. There's lots of things to winning the net battle. It's not just as clean cut as if I win the net, I'm going to get the attack. Obviously, that is one of them, but it's not that. And I think An Seong did that absolutely brilliantly. And like I said, you could see if you watch that match back as the match goes on, Yamaguchi's belief that can she win this, can she create chances, just starts to kind of fade from her. So I think for Yamaguchi, she's my favorite player. She needs to go away, and obviously what worked in Korea was, the attacking game. That is definitely the game that's going to be effective. That's definitely something that even Seong's coach Park Ju-bong said could potentially be a weakness to Seong, is when players come at her, and you're starting to see more of these top players are trying to take it to Seong. And that's definitely the game plan. But if Seong is able to counter that, not by necessarily attacking herself, but pushing up and really working hard in that front court area, then that can take away. And obviously Yamaguchi's going to have to go away and go, well, what happens if Seong doesn't allow me to attack as easily? How am I going to re-win the net? How am I going to counter what Seong's doing? But yeah, no. And like I said, Seong in an interview afterwards said that she just upped her pace, especially moving forward. And that was the deciding factor. And yes, no, absolutely incredible. But last thing I'll say about Seong and Yamaguchi, and this is one thing I couldn't help but think about, is because these two played each other in the final of the Denmark Open. I think it was 2021 final, and it was the one where Seong ended up basically almost dead, and it was a real slugfest. I think it was another year where the shuttles were very slow and the games were that. But just watch the difference between these two players. Obviously, the game wasn't as close, but the level, the speed, and the attack that both players are playing at is far, far higher. For me, that's a good example of the direction that women's singles is going in. It is becoming far more physical. You have to be incredibly good athlete to be able to play, and you have to be able to play and attack. And you can't just grind. Obviously you can kind of grind out odd matches here and there, but in general, again, you come against players like Seong and Yamaguchi, the two of the best players in the world right now. There needs to be more to it than that. Now in the final, following on from that, actually, is for the first time in the whole tournament. I know Seong had, I think, the slightly slower end, so maybe slightly easier, but her attack, her game came out incredibly fast. And in fact, actually, I wrote here in my notes that she was playing a little bit like her coach, Lee Hyun-il. I think I've compared Seong and the way she moves to Chen Long. She kind of glides around, she wins a lot on her quality, her very good accuracy, her great defensive skills, and she can counter quite well. Chen Long's not known for blistering attack, although he can attack well, but he would kind of construct really good rallies, almost play like a brick wall, and then when he got his chance, he would then finish you, and Seong plays like that. But also, Lee Hyun-il was a little bit like that as well. One of the best movers in all of badminton, and I actually think the way that Seong is playing, I think there's definitely been some influence from him in her game. Obviously, she already kind of had that, and he's probably building on it. But I wrote here, she was in the first game being very proactive. She played with incredible variety. Her accuracy on the attack was something that was up by a massive point. I mean, criticisms of Seong sometimes when I've seen her is when she's attacking, it is quite central. Obviously, that means she doesn't make mistakes, but it also doesn't apply as much pressure as possible to her opponents. In this final, especially in the opening game, her accuracy was absolutely on point. She was obviously doing similar things to what worked against Yamaguchi. She was pushing on the front court, and there was just constant presence and pressure. This was the thing that I mentioned that was lacking a little bit when she played the World Championships, that she was almost just getting the shuttle over. In this final and then in this tournament, when she was really on it, she was playing with a real kind of goal in mind. Like I said, I think in the last video or something, I was talking about Seong, she's very good at, she maintains, she gets a slight advantage, and each shot she adds maybe 1% of advantage up and up and up until obviously the pressure becomes too much. She's not someone that Tai Ying, who can pull out something absolutely brilliant regularly and can go from a rally where you're 50-50 and suddenly it leaps like this. Seong is very much more methodical and kind of slowly applies more and more pressure. It's like being in a vice and gradually being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. Now, obviously, in the second game, because the first game, I think it was 5 to Seong, it was an absolute blitzing. And then as we got to the second game, it almost seemed like a reversal. Obviously, Wang Ziyi was playing on the slower end. She started to attack more. She had a little bit more confidence. She was playing a little bit faster. And it seemed like we were going to go to a third game. I think it was 18-10 to Wang Ziyi. And then An Seong kind of, I don't know, she could have easily just gone, right, okay, let's like not completely roll over, but let's focus on the third. But clearly she was like, no, I'm still in this. And so she fought really, really hard, and she was able to come back. And she worked incredibly hard because, in all honesty, I think bar maybe the last rally, the rally she actually won, where she played more clears or shots to the backcourt in that rally than she did from 18-10 down up to whatever it was, 22-21 or 23-22. Because obviously with the faster haul, she was having to work really hard. She only really used the rear court if she was in a really good position. Like the occasional clear, but from the front, if she was really high up, then she felt she could play the back. If she was slightly low or slightly behind, she was down, 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 down. And that is an incredibly brutal way to play badminton. You could see she was bent over double. She was working so hard, but she clung in there. Now, I must also say, I think a big part in what helped An Seong win was, I think Wang Zi had another one of her Wang Zi moments. We've seen her do that against An Seong this year, I think at the All England, when she went from being a set and a game and something up and being in pretty good and then suddenly fading. We've seen her do that in other tournaments as well, against different opposition. She can have these little lapses, these little moments. I think the main focus should be on what a great performance, what a digging deep kind of moment it was for Seong. They're absolutely brilliant, very well deserved. And she was even able to do it when she took a kind of like nasty slip at 18-all. She still stuck with it. She, like I said, worked incredibly hard and was very deserved of her title. Last thing I want to talk about, I've already mentioned talking about what a difference a year can make. That we've seen. Obviously, the BKA in itself has completely turned around, not just by having a different chairman or a different head coach, but I know that some of the approaches they've allowed players to have their own sponsors. We've certainly seen players playing with Yonex and players playing with Viktor. We saw that in the women's doubles, two pairs with two different sponsors. We've never seen it before. I've just heard today that the China Badminton League, Sir Sun Jae is a player that's been invited. That's obviously something that would have had to get approval, when obviously maybe in the old system, maybe might not have got. So clearly they're coming up. So we talk about An Seong. I think she's got her own personal sponsorship deal outside of the organisation. Lots of things have changed, but maybe I know there are a lot of discussions about, An Seong hasn't had as dominant a year. She still had a really good year. And people have kind of put it down towards, I know at the Worlds there was talk about she put too much pressure on herself. She was trying to play too perfect. And she's even admitted that at this tournament she wanted to come in and enjoy her badminton. And you could kind of see that she's still fighting between, getting that balance between enjoying and relaxing, but also, having to be very serious and working really hard and really putting it there. It's quite a fine balance to sometimes to kind of weigh out and marry up. But I think another thing actually is, because of all the changes, we have to understand that for someone like An Seong, that might take some time to getting used to. Park Ju-bong is going to be a different head coach. He's much more hands-on. We know what he did with Japan. He's sat behind the court a lot more. Obviously, he's going to have a lot of input. We've already heard what he said, his opinions of An Seong in terms of she needs to be a little bit more aggressive. And obviously, the way An Seong plays, that isn't necessarily natural to her. So that's going to take a little bit of time. Obviously, Lee Hyun-il's come in. He's going to have his own opinions. So it's going to take a little time, I think, for her to adjust. Obviously, she's adjusting pretty well and stuff. But it just, like I said, combined with everything that's gone on, the difference we've seen in a year, we've had the Denmark 2024 and 2025. I already said it's like night and day. But I think part of that, we need to we might see a few more tournaments where we might not see the best An Seong, because maybe she's obviously a fantastic player and will be able to kind of adapt and take on really well. But at the same time, whenever there's any changes or lots of things and you're trying to take that on board, then I think it can sometimes cause odd performance dips, or maybe, it could explain why we're not seeing the best An Seong all the time. I could just be missing the mark here, but that's kind of something that I thought no one's really spoken of that, and I just wanted to kind of lay that out here. But yeah, no, Fantastic performance for Anseong. Very well deserved. Congratulations on completing the Super 750s. And for me, it was just great that she's enjoying her badminton, and also that she's obviously got a team behind her that she really believes in. And that's great, because we were sat here last year thinking, is she going to, you know, is this it? Is she going to retire, or is she going to try and move away from go independent or whatever? Especially when BK announced that they would allow players to enter tournaments outside of the National Association. Would Anseong, as the bridge has been burned too much? But clearly, uh, relationships have been reformed, and it's absolutely brilliant to see. So let's move on. I want to talk next about Chen and Yifan, because obviously this wasn't the first tournament. They've obviously, we're talking about the Olympic champions, and they've been reunited for, I think they're reuniting for 3 tournaments, with this Denmark Open being the second. I think the first one was, I don't think it was, did they play last week at the Arctic? I think they did, actually, they did. I think it's this European tour that they are reuniting for. I don't know why, whether it's just a send-off for these two, or maybe I heard someone say Zhang Shushan, Jifan's recent partner, might have a few issues, so she might be using this time to just take some time off and let those heal. I'm not quite sure, but it doesn't really matter. Let's enjoy the Olympic champions and 4-time world champions, and a pair that have won absolutely everything. Let's enjoy watching them a few more times. And they put on a good show at the Denmark Open. They reached the semi-finals, where they eventually lost to Kim Hee-jong and Kong Hee-young of Korea. Now, let's quickly talk about that match. I think the first thing is, it was quite obvious to me that Kim and Kong were picking on Chen. They probably felt that physically she was the weaker one. She definitely was, in my opinion. She has, I think the big reason for that is not that she probably hasn't been training, but let's compare her to Yifan. Yifan's been playing regularly on the World Tour at the highest level. She is match fit. She's in great condition. She won her last few tournaments with Zhang Shushan, whereas Chen, we haven't really seen her. We've seen her change partners a few times. At the highest level, really, we only saw her play at the Sudirman Cup. So I think they were obviously picking on her, knew that she wasn't match fit. And you could see that in the semi-final. She was able to hold it together for the first game, although it could have been, it ended up being 21-18 to the Koreans. I think it could have been a bigger margin. The Chinese were able to close it at the end. You could see that Chen, after certain shots, she was kind of like walking around the court. Usually she's quite very energetic and emotive, really putting 100% into everything. And you could see she was still putting 100%, but 100% was way down on what we know she is capable of. And in this, obviously, after the first game, the second game, it wasn't even close. And it was the slower end for the Chinese. They had to work even harder. And I think by the end, Chen was a little tired. She was a spent force. I think another thing that did affect them, obviously, is the conditions were brutally hard on the players, but also in their quarterfinal, they had an absolute epic match against Igarashi and Shida, a pair that played incredibly fast, that were really fast. So for Chen to be able to match that speed and deliver a win, should have had to go above and beyond. And I think she just wasn't quite able to obviously bring that again in the semi-finals against another pair that have won tournaments recently and have been playing incredibly good badminton. Now, I think the last thing I will say about their performances, actually for me, it's not all about the fact that Chen is, you could say, a shadow of her former self. She's nowhere near the level that she was when they won the Olympic Games. But I think it's interesting. I talked about how Kim and Kong picked on Chen, but when they did play to Yifan, it was mainly when she was at the back of the court, which, if you think about the way Chen and Yifan played, Yifan was usually the rear court player. So you would think if they were going to get Chen, they'd want to keep her, if they were going to play to Yifan, maybe they'd want to play to her when she's near the net, because they would feel less threatened by that. I know there's other reasons to why you play the back. Sometimes that's a little bit easier in general, but for me, what was quite interesting, it shows how much Yifan has improved as a front court player, as a rear court player, as a front court player. Sorry, no, a front court player. I think what I mentioned this in a recent famous breakdown is Zhang Shushan was never a great power player, didn't have a big smash. But when I watched them recently, they seem to win more points when Zhang's at the back and Jar's at the net. And I think a big part of that is Yifan has really stepped up her ability to read and play from the front of the court. So I just noticed that Of course, Chen, if you lift her to the back, she has to work harder. So, you know, etc. But when they did play to Yifan, they were okay to play to her when she was at the back. And that meant that Chen was at the front, which you thought wouldn't really make sense. But I think it's because Yifan has become so much more dangerous from the front of the court and probably could do more from there than she could from the back. But yeah, no, it was a great tournament for Chen, Yifan, and it did seem like they were having fun together. I saw a number of social media posts of them doing things in and around Denmark. So they're clearly enjoying their final tournaments together. I don't know what's going to happen to Chen, or whether she's going to retire. I think there's the Chinese national games, which I'm sure she'll want to play before she goes. Obviously, makes sense for her to want to have one more go at that. But yeah, no, really good to see that they're having fun, and I look forward to watching them play in the French Open, which I know I'm not quite sure what the conditions will be like, but I know it's a smaller arena, which generally means it could be faster, which might actually help them, where there's not going to be as many long, drawn-out rallies. So next, I want to talk about Viktor Axelsen, the two-time Olympic champion. Now, he has been on the hunt for, I know it's only been this Denmark Open was only his third tournament back, but he's obviously been on the hunt for a result, a kind of performance to give him that huge confidence, that belief that he can get back to somewhere where his former level is after his back surgery, because he had back surgery earlier this year, and this was his third tournament. Obviously, he's had surgery before. I think he had surgery on ankle to remove bone spurs or something in his ankle, and he was obviously able to come back even stronger from that. But there's a slight difference between your ankle getting surgery on it and your back. Your back obviously is going to take longer, and then add to that he's also older. He's now 31 years old. So coming back from back surgery at that time, I've heard a number of people that have back surgery, and it can be, it's one of those surgeries that there's not always guaranteed that you're going to have the results, the desired effect that you want. So obviously here at the Denmark Open, Viktor Axelsen was able to reach the semi-finals, which is obviously a great performance, a great result for him. And even he admitted that it's given him great confidence that he can get close back to his top level. But it wasn't just the semi-final result that's given the confidence. It was the fact that in the quarterfinals, and even in the earlier rounds, I think in his first round, he beat the winner from last week, the Arctic Open, Chen. Although Cho was a little bit down, must have been incredibly fatigued, and we all saw the pictures of his blisters. Obviously, the second round, he beat Yushi Tanaka, but it was the quarterfinal result where he beat, it was a repeat of the Olympic final, where he beat the world number 3 and world silver medalist, former world champion, Kunle Vititsan. That was the result that is the one where he admitted after that's the result, giving him the confidence that he is on the right track, that he can return to his best form. And it was clearly an emotional moment for him, because when he won, and I think it was Hoki decided that the shuttle, confirmed that the last shuttle was out and Viktor had won, fell to his knees, sobbing, was very emotional, and obviously incredibly happy for that result. But the real question is he actually back? Well, to me, I think he kind of is. He's obviously not at 100%. I think Viktor is probably floating around 70 to 75, maybe 80% at an absolute push of his absolute best. Because other than his semi-final versus Shiuchi, he did start rather slow all week, and he was also far from perfect. But having said that, he obviously found ways to win and dig deep, and did show a great champion's mentality in that respect. Sorry, he did actually do that in the semi-final as well. So I'm just trying to quickly glance at my notes here. He did do that in the semi-final against Shiuchi, but obviously wasn't actually able to win. He did eventually lose to the current world champion in 3 games. Now, talking of his match versus Shiuchi, there is some controversy to the match, but I'm going to get to that in the Q&A section, because I had the vast majority of questions were asking about that, and I want to give it its own section. What I want to focus here is, like I said, Viktor's level and where he can go from here. So for me, I felt that the things that improved, his attack was more accurate and more dangerous. We know that Viktor's attack is one of his biggest weapons. He's got a humongous smash. Obviously, he can hit it very, very steeply. But when I watched, obviously, this is understandable when his, in your first one back, especially after surgery, the accuracy and the quality of it wasn't so good. Especially, I think for me, Viktor has always been quite good. He's quite tall. He can kind of still hit very steep when it looks like it's a little bit behind him. And in his previous tournaments, he was still trying to do certain shots, but they just lacked accuracy. And then he's twisted and turned. He's then moved. So, for example, around the head, he'll hit a shot, and he'll try to go for his cross-court shot that he's usually pretty accurate, or that one down the line, and they're just coming in towards the players, and they're able to move him, and then he gets twisted and turned. So those kind of shots were definitely more accurate in general, and he was winning far more rallies with his big attacks, whereas if you watch his matches from the China Masters and the Hong Kong Open, he wasn't winning as much. I think the big area where he definitely does look a lot better is in his defence. He looks more comfortable. I made note of that at the Badminton Excel event, especially twisting down low and fast around the front of the court. He still looks, obviously, this is the area where I think it's going to be one of the hardest to improve. In general, he's quite tall, so it's quite a difficult area. He's done a lot of work throughout his entire career trying to kind of develop that area. But that's still going to be a difficult area, especially if his back is a little bit stiff. So one thing I noted here is if he was obviously pulled out of position and then has to defend, his defense was still a little bit susceptible. If his defense looked stronger, if he was kind of in his position compared to Hong Kong and China, if he was kind of set in his defense, it looked a little bit better. He looked a little bit freer. Twisting down to his backhand defense, he was able to get to those shots a little bit more. But still, if he was obviously pulled out of position, say he like blocked out and then quickly crossed, those kind of situations, he still looked a little bit stiff. Especially, you could really notice it if when you watch the camera angle from the social media angle right by the court, you can see he just looks. You can tell he looks a little bit stiff. From the TV court, it looks quite good, but when you get that close up, you can see that it's not flowing quite as well as we know it can be. Still huge improvements on from Hong Kong and China. But I still think obviously he's got plenty more to go, and I'm sure Viktor knows that. The last thing I'll say in terms of it is I'm definitely seeing the Peter Gader influences in his game, especially his front court. He's doing a lot of kind of like these little like delay shots like that. He's always been capable. He's obviously an incredibly talented player. I remember even when he was a junior, when obviously juniors are a little bit more flashy, he was doing all sorts of shots like that. But he's definitely starting to do that a little bit more. The holds and the plays from the net are starting to look a little bit more Gader-esque. And I think that's obviously something that Gader, the reason he's been brought on is because Gader had such success into his 30s. Viktor's now into his 30s, and he probably wants someone that, what did you do differently? Because obviously if you take Gader again, when he was younger, very, very attacking, very, very basic, very, very fast, still skillful. Then he had his knee injury and he got a bit older and he had to develop other things. And obviously then as he got much older, he had to rely more on his crazy skills and deceptions. And I think Viktor's at a stage where he might have to do the same thing. But I'm starting to see the little bit of the Peter Gader influence. But obviously, let's not forget this is only Viktor's third tournament back, but the early signs are great. And personally, what I'll finish this section with is I do think we will see Viktor winning more titles again, possibly even more major titles, more world titles, maybe even LA. Who knows? I still think it's possible for him. But like I said before, I think his days of being super dominant in the men's singles, the kind of alien Viktor that I can remember all the memes and stuff from, I think those days are over. There are just too many players in the men's singles these days that are capable of winning. And with his age, I think with back surgery, which is tough to come back from, I can't see another dominant run. But more titles, more majors. People ask, can he get back up to world number one? That also might be difficult, but I wouldn't rule him out of it. If he can get his confidence going, if he can, like I said, I think he's at about 75% of what he's capable of. If he can obviously get that closer to 100%, I think he is definitely still capable. He's still got a good few more years in him. I think he could definitely go to LA and, be within a chance. But we'll have to see on that. Obviously, you never quite know. You can't completely predict the future. But based on what I've seen, that's just his third tournament back. That's quite an impressive comeback. And he's only going to keep getting better and better and better. And we know that Viktor's incredibly professional, takes things super seriously. And with that attitude, anything is possible for him. The last thing I want to talk about before we get to the Q&A, and that's I want to talk about the Japanese pair, the men's doubles pair, Hoki and Kobayashi. Those two finally, after over 2 years, are back atop the podium. It was actually their first final in almost a year. I did say, if you remember, I'm pretty sure, I can't remember which breakdown it was in, but it was one of the ones, around the summer period. I think it was around the Southeast Asian tour, the Malaysian Masters, Thailand Open, Singapore Open, that Indonesian Open, that kind of period. I can remember watching them play and thinking, these two are playing well. They're not winning. They weren't getting really deep into tournaments, but the way they were playing, and every time I watched them every week, they were getting that little bit better. I was like, these two are playing well. Don't rule these two out. They can definitely come back. They can definitely win more titles. And obviously, they've gone and won the Denmark Open. I think someone actually asked me recently on one of these, do you think Hoki and Kobayashi will actually win a title this year based on that you keep saying that they are getting better? And I didn't answer that question, but I remember thinking, yeah, I think they can. And here we are. And I think one huge thing I want to say before we get into how they played in specific matches, again, I want to focus more on the semis and the finals, is I think some huge credit has to go to Lee Wanhua, who's a former fantastic player from Malaysia. And I'm not quite sure how long he's been in Japan. It's not been too long, but I think his influence on the Japanese team, on the men's doubles squad, has been good, not just with Hoki and Kobayashi. They are struggling a little bit with some other pairs, but I think he's doing really good work. And one thing I was really impressed with, again, I'm not quite sure how long he's been in Japan, but he's doing the coaching in Japanese. We've seen other Malaysian coaches go to Japan and they stick with the broken English, obviously the English that the players can understand. But the fact that Lee Wanhua is conversing, I'm not quite sure how good it is. Japanese viewers, you can kind of tell me, is Japanese up to scratch? But he's able to clearly converse and get a message across in Japanese. So that's obviously some credit towards him. Like I said, very well deserved. They beat some great pairs with huge wins in the semi-final. That huge win in the semi-final over Ranki Reddy, because that was a pair they hadn't beaten in six years. I know there'll be a lot of people, my Indian fans will go, well, that's just Ranki and Shetty. I got loads of questions again. What's it going to take for those two to they've been in semi-finals, and they've been, obviously before this, they've been in 2 or 3 consecutive finals. What's going to take them to get a title? I'm not going to answer that question because I want to focus on Hoki and Kobayashi. But I know we're going to get fans that will kind of put it into the fact that Ranki Reddy didn't play particularly well. I would argue that and say, no, I thought they did. I just thought that the way that the Japanese played was absolutely phenomenal. In that semi-final, the one thing that really stood out to me, there's some other ones that I'll quickly list, but for me, in the Ranki Reddy quarterfinal, where they played the new Indonesian pair of Ardianto and Ramat Hidyat, who I actually think they're a new pair. They're quite exciting. But one thing that went against the Indonesians was when they were below the tape. This happened quite a lot in the service situation. If they were in a slightly below tape, they too often would try to hit hard. And the Indians are very organised. Again, I think that's from their time with Matthias Bo, because he was very good at this with his partner, Carsten Mogensen, is you'd push down and then you'd want them to try and go flat for you, and you just cover both channels. And the Indians are so good in that situation. And Ardianto and Ramat, if they played soft or kind of push through and try to hit it at the Indians' feet in those situations, they were very successful. But too often they got wrapped up into that situation, playing too fast. And that was one thing that the Japanese did slightly better, was they were able to, when they're in those situations, they were changing, like doing little angle changes or the soft pushes, that little more. They still got caught in that trap, of course. There's a reason the Indians do it, because they're able to kind of get players to kind of react in that way naturally under that kind of pressure. But I felt that the Japanese, in those situations, if they were below tape, played soft. They played the gaps. They were willing to sometimes go over the top, because Indians sometimes they press and they come up. And there is space to go over them, although obviously if you don't get the right length, it's quite dangerous, because they both have phenomenal attack and both really tall and powerful. But for me, that's one thing that I felt that Hoki and Kobayashi did really, really well. Obviously, there were some other things. I felt that the Japanese did win the service situation, and this rolls over a little bit into the final as well. But obviously, Yugo Kobayashi's smash in his attack, his steepness on his attack and his variation, especially like around the head, like cross smash like this, absolutely amazing. I thought Takura Hoki was back to his best at the front. He's always been a really good front court player, but he was really willing. The one negative about them in the past, sometimes he's a little bit hesitant. There's something that's just holding him back from really going at it, and he was willing to do that a little bit more. I think what helped him is that Kobayashi, I know he's had his injury issues and now he's obviously back to full fitness. He's picking up some of those duties. He's a little bit more moving around the back. So Hoki can actually push up and have a little more faith that anything that goes over him, Kobayashi can attack pretty much anything. Whereas maybe when Kobayashi was having some issues with his knee that he's had or was on the comeback, he hesitated because maybe he was trying to help out. I don't know. But whatever the reason was, whatever the reason, Hoki was pushing up the court and was taking on that absolutely amazing. That was really obviously winning the net a lot, and that was setting up, like I said, that monstrous attack from Yugo Kobayashi. And then in the final, I think actually they were able to do they were using a similar tactic. I actually thought that the final might be quite difficult for Hoki and Kobayashi because I felt that one thing they were doing quite well, like I said, the soft pushes and like changing the angles, because obviously Alfian and Fikri are both very good frontcourt players. I thought they might be able to obviously not only beat Hoki at the net and really kind of control that area, but if they were trying to in defense, like push flat through and all that kind of stuff, that the speed of the Indonesians at the net might kind of get them into trouble. But they were able to obviously deal with that. What I felt they did a little bit differently in the final was, especially as the match got further away, because it was obviously incredibly tight, is we, rather than just like kind of like basic like this, like boom or this, they were almost hold and then were changing the angles a lot more. They got a bit more confident in like little delays and changing the angles, and you could see their confidence growing as the match went on and on and on. Another thing I felt that the Japanese did well, like I said, they were using those soft plays from a slightly worse position, but they were also, I think, at the crucial stages in the third, they were focusing on maintaining their balance and, like I said, some subtle change. That's it, subtle change of direction. That's the kind of stuff that I've already mentioned. But I think, really, if you had to summarize Hoki and Kobayashi, is we know how good they are. They've been in 2 world finals. They've been world champions. They've won other tournaments. I remember their run in the Bali bubble and how well they were playing in that period of time. And they've got their set formations, they've got what works, but obviously to be effective, it's got to be all flowing. And in this tournament, it was definitely all flowing. Like I said, little situations like the defensive one with Kobayashi blocking and then shifting, with Hoki coming forward, Hoki always pushing up, Kobayashi with the subtle changes, both of them having that confidence and calmness under, like when the shutter's coming faster than just to lay it into the gaps, to lay it soft at their opponent's feet, taking some of the speed out when they're not in a good position, maintaining their balance. Everything was all really, really good. Okay, so like I said, what a fantastic win for them. It's great to see them back on top of the podium, and I hope this gives them confidence. If they can stay injury free, then again they could be a pair. I think they've just got themselves back into the world top 10. Be interesting to see if they can push up any higher and get back up into like the world top 5, kind of the position where they're more than capable of being. So moving on, we're going to go to the Q&A section. Now, I know some of you might already be thinking, well, Ben, what about this player? What about that player? Don't worry, some of these questions, the reason I haven't done their own section is because the questions are interesting, or I have multiple questions about certain players. So the first one is, what is his, this is about Jonatan Christie, biggest improvement according to you? So obviously Christie has won back-to-back tournaments now. He won in Korea, and obviously he's backed it up by winning the Denmark Open. And for me, obviously his improvements, let's quickly go through. Obviously at the beginning of this year or earlier this year, he left the PBSI, so he went independent, which is a huge undertaking, and it comes with all its other issues. So obviously you're now in charge of your own training, your own recovery, organising your tournaments, your travel. There's lots of things. I'm sure he's going to have a support network. He's going to have his own team around him. But obviously the early stages, that's quite a different thing to get adapted to, especially from a system like Indonesia where everything like is supported for him, and he's obviously had that way. So now that he's got to suddenly take on all this responsibility, he's obviously going to have people around him, but he's still going to have to be responsible for that. So like I said, that's quite a big change. And obviously that goes with, I know Chico Wadoyo has went independent with him, and they're probably training together, but finding good enough training partners, that might be quite difficult. Or there's lots of these little things that he would have had to have kind of sorted out, and maybe that might be something that might have affected some of his early performances after that decision. I know also he did mention in an interview that he'd been struggling with his body, so whether that's injury issues or just means that he was finding it difficult to get himself into shape. Again, that might be a follow-on from the fact that he hadn't quite sorted out what works for him training-wise. He's been so used to having it all laid out for him, and now he's got to do it himself. All these little things. But I think, obviously, if you add to the fact that those are probably reasons why he struggled, plus men's singles is incredibly tough. But in terms of improvements, I think what I'd like to really more talk about is, for me, there's clear signs of when Christie is playing well, and there's clear signs of when he's not playing well. And that isn't just when he wins or when he loses. It's more how he's playing. So for me, when Christie is blending his physical with his really good attack. So Christie has got a lot of creativity and variety of his net shots, but he's one of the best players in men's singles in the flat game. He's always been that way. I can remember when he was giving Momota, when Momota was at his absolute best, some really difficult times because of flat game. And he did the same thing to Viktor as well. So when he's using that, that's one sign. Obviously, he's incredibly physical. I think someone wrote Christie doesn't skip leg day, and that's true. And when I stood next to him at the BXL, or when I was interviewing him, that guy is like a barn door. He's so wide, but he's so narrow, and I said if he wanted to be a bodybuilder, he probably could be. That guy is an absolute athlete. He's a specimen in that respect. So obviously he has a great physical capacity. He is very strong. But when he blends that, like I said, with the flat game, with jump smashes, with proactivity, with attacking stuff, that for me is always a sign of Jonatan Christie is playing well. When the attacking proactive side sucks out of him and he relies more on his physical, and we see him playing loads more drop shots, loads more clears, I always say to my wife, Christie's playing like a 1980s men's singles player again, then I start to worry. More slow drops, like I said, no drives, very basic net. If I'm seeing that, then that's a sign that Christie's not feeling confident or is not going to have the best of times. I'd also add to that how he reacts to certain situations, because sometimes in the past he starts off with a great attack, great physical, blending those two things together, and you're like, okay, Christie's playing well. Then an opponent might change their tactics or do something to take that away, whether he does something where Christie suddenly can't attack, or he plays dead net, so there's nothing speed for him to do his drives off. How Christie reacts to that is also a good sign. But here in this tournament in the Denmark Open, there were times where some players were able to kind of take things away from him, but he kind of stuck to his guns. There were times where he went through poor patches against Li Shifeng. That was one example. He was a game in 2018 up, lost that, was miles up in the third, and then he allowed Li Shifeng to come back in, and I was a bit like, oh, okay, but no, he stuck with it. He kept doing the things that were working. He wasn't kind of like reverting back. And for me, whether that last point, how he reacts to certain situations, tactical changes done by his opponent or opponent breaking rhythm, maybe that's one of the big things he's improved. But I think for me, it's just his ability at the moment. We'll have to see how he can maintain this, and maybe he can develop a level of consistency with this. But it's always been, for me, Christie, about his approach to the game, because, like I said, he is incredibly physical. If it needs to come down to a running game, he's going to win a lot, but he needs to have that attack because he's got a phenomenal attack, and he was using that, to be fair, really well. And in the conditions, which were a little bit slower, slow shuttles, he's still doing it, which I think is a really good sign, and one definitely for the future. Do you think Alfian/Fikri partnership should be a permanent, despite their quite successful results so far? I find it a bit frustrating knowing the shuttle is very hard to kill from the backcourt. I personally still prefer a hard-hitting player in backcourt like Daniel Martin. Now, first thing about Daniel Martin, obviously he is trying to come back from knee injury. We're not quite sure how long it's going to take. But I've always said when it comes to him, I think he should be a mixed player. Maybe the ACL injury might put an end to that, because his ability to obviously mix, you have to be able to cover the backcourt probably a bit better than he can. And with a knee injury on top of that, that's not going to be too easy. But I always felt the way that he moved and played and just his build, I think he could have been like he's like a Praveen Tantawi blend. Like he's got like a little bit more power than Tantawi, maybe not quite as much finesse and touch, but he's got more of those kind of Tantawi shots than say Praveen did. I think he could have actually been a mixed player, a really good one for Indonesia. But whether we'll see that, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure he'll probably stick doubles. Although, who's he going to partner when he comes back? That would be quite interesting. I think there isn't. I'm trying to think of a partner that's out there that he could have, because you've got Ardianto and Ramat. I know that's only playing one tournament, but they're playing together and they did pretty well. Obviously, Alfian and Fikri, I do think are going to stick. Rinov Rivaldi and Rambitan are partnering because they both left the national centre. You've got Carnando and Maulana are a pair. So who you really left for Daniel Martin? It'll be interesting to see what he does. Maybe if he is, they might try him in the mixed doubles. Who knows? But anyway, I've kind of sidetracked on the question there. For me, yes, I do think they should be permanent because, in all honesty, what are the other choices? There aren't any. Daniel Martin, maybe you could say you could try in, but we've seen those. And I think the way Alfian and Fikri are playing, for me, yes, power is a weakness, but I wouldn't say they're completely devoid of power. And they do play with a lot of variation. And they're very, very quick around each other. They rotate really well. And yes, of course, there's going to be some pairs that might be able to, a bit like we saw with the Minions when they came up against Watanabe and Endo, where they could just do the defensive game. And that might be a potential weakness for them. But I think they're both good enough, and they've got enough power where they could figure things out and kind of come up with their own solution. So yeah, whilst on one hand you could say, this is the clear tactic to beat Alfian and Fikri, although that wasn't the tactic that I think Hoki and Kobayashi used, but it could be a tactic that in, say, bigger, more expansive arenas we might see. But then you've got to remember that Alfian and Fikri are good enough to go, well, let's counter that with this. So just because there is an easy counter to that, I'm sure they'll be figuring out a way to kind of counter that back if that situation arises. And another thing, I think they seem to be enjoying playing together. They have a good rapport, which for me is the thing that brings the best results in doubles. We always talk about pairs like, we talk about Hendra Setiawan and Mohamed Hassan. One of their biggest strengths was that they got on so well. They had a great relationship. They understood their roles. They got on well off court. They never really argued with each other. The rapport was there. And look at the results those two had. And clearly, I think Alfian and Fikri get along well and they're enjoying. And the first, I can't remember how many tournaments they've played now, 4 or 5? And their worst result was their first tournament, which was a quarter-final. They've reached semi-finals at least of every tournament they've played, and majority of the time they've been in the final. So I think with the great results, the fact that Indonesia haven't really got anyone else, and yeah, who would be the other options? They're doing well, consistently well. Yes, of course, there's going to be counters to the way they play, but you would say that about absolutely every pair. So, right, moving on. So yeah, I do think they should be a permanent pair if that wasn't already obvious. Can you talk a bit on how Kim and Sir lost to the Malaysian pair? So yeah, obviously Kim Won-ho and Sir Sanjay lost in the second round to Tan Wee Kyong and Mohamed Azrin. I know that he's got more to his name, but it's quite a long-winded name. I haven't written it down, but that's how I remember him. So how did they lose? I thought this was obviously a really impressive win for the Malaysians. They're obviously a good pair. Tan Wee Kong, let's not forget, is an Olympic silver medalist. And Azrin's incredibly skillful and fast. But I thought this was impressive, not because they beat the world number ones, but because of the conditions in Denmark. I thought it was playing quite slow, and as we saw, we thought that would play perfectly into the hands of the Korean pairs. We saw the women's doubles, it was an all-Korean final because the conditions were slower and their defensive game works really, really well. How they did it, I felt that they played with lots of variety. Like I said, they weren't going to just power through the Koreans. The Koreans, if they set themselves in the defense, is too rock solid. They played with a lot of heavy slices, a lot of cross matches. I spoke about the tactics that worked at the Arctic Open where we had similar conditions, slower conditions. The two pairs that got to the final played with lots of wild and creative shots and all that kind of thing. And I felt that Tan Wee Kyong and Azrin did the same thing. I felt on defence, they defended with purpose. They didn't just kind of defend basically. So they were looking to kind of lay off. They were looking to kind of always be creative, always stepping onto the front foot. All that kind of taking it to their opponent, always changing their angles. Like I already said, that's a similar tactic to what we saw work at the Arctic Open. I think what they did, like I said, I felt that when I watched it, I was kind of watching a replication of when Alfian and Fikri beat Kim and So at the China Open. Lots of variations, playing with high speed, and they can break down and unsettle the Koreans' defense. You can't play basic. Like I said, you can't play basic against this Korean pair. You either have to play incredibly fast and blast them as best you can, like I've said before, Ching and Ren Sheng you were able to do for like a game and a bit at the All England, or you have to play with so much variety and creativity and kind of get them in around their body like this and kind of not give them anything to kind of no rhythm to play off. And that's what Alfian and Fikri did well at the China Open. And I think that's what Tan Kyong and Asrin did really well in the Denmark Open. I think obviously it's very easy here to sit here and say that the Koreans maybe had a bit of a bad day. It wasn't quite them, but I think that would be a little bit unfair to the Malaysians. I think it's more them playing well than the Koreans playing badly. I did think actually the Koreans were fist pumping their up for it. Obviously, it's a Super 750, and I felt there's a few times I felt that the Koreans might be getting a hold of the match, but the Malaysians stuck to their tactics. And actually, I thought the last thing I'll say is, like we spoke about, lots of variety, lots of front foot defense, lots of heavy slicing, lots of kind of doing something, always trying to do something with the shuttle. And the Malaysians actually, that's very hard to do, especially against a pair like him, and so do that consistently. And actually, that's something that Malaysians did really well. It's very easy to play that way and hit one or two winners, but give your opponents 3 or 4 mistakes in return. And if you do that, you're not going to win. But they did it the other way around. For every one mistake they made 4 winners. Or something like that. I'm not trying to be specific here, but that's the kind I'm trying to get a point there. That they were making more winners and more chances and being more consistent than they were giving away mistakes. Second half of both games were really good, especially the second. Like I said, 2 ways you beat Kim and So, in my eyes. Play incredibly fast and just you have an absolutely monstrous attack and you just blast your way through, which I think is something that probably doesn't work as well now. Or you have to play like I think Alfian and Fikri did in China and Asrin and Tan Kyong did in Denmark, and how Fikri has done with other partners. I think Maulana and Fikri did that really well at the Sudirman Cup as well. There's lots of changing of angles and lots of high speed and rotation around each other. So yeah, that for me is how they won. Okay, so last question, and this is the controversy that I mentioned, I alluded to earlier, and that's my thoughts on the exchange between Axelsen and Xiuqi, in brackets, Axelsen's serve. So let me quickly explain the situation for anyone that didn't see it. I think this situation all kind of came to a head right at the beginning of the third game at Lovell. Now I've heard different people that it was Xiuqi. Basically, it looked like Viktor went to change shuttle without asking Xiuqi, but I don't think that was necessarily the issue. I think before that, Xiuqi was obviously going over to the service judge, I think, to talk to him about Axelsen's serve, because obviously, as we know, Axelsen does this side-to-side motion, and he does take quite a while to serve. Even Jill Clark in his earlier matches was going, surely that's a fault because of the new ruling where it's not necessarily illegal to do this, but you can't cause undue delay. So if you're doing it obviously too long, you're taking too long to serve, and technically that's something that new rules have been put in place, because we started to see, obviously we've seen Shetty do that, Sursen J to an extent does that, but Victor's probably the worst culprit. He's done it for a number of years, and I think Xiuqi obviously maybe was getting a little bit kind of like, why haven't they been called, and just had a few words with the service judge. As he was doing it, Viktor noticed that, obviously got himself involved. They had a few words. I wouldn't necessarily call it heated. If you think that's heated, then that's a little bit, yeah. But they had an exchange. Obviously, the umpire got involved, called them over. And then it carried on and all this kind of stuff. And then obviously from there, I definitely saw a few things where there were a few odd glances from Viktor after certain points and all that kind of thing. And again, after the match ended, when she had won, when they were shaking hands, again, they were just talking a little bit, etc. So that was kind of the situation. And it kind of has blown up online a little bit, people calling out Viktor for unsporting behaviour, disgusting behaviour, all that kind of stuff. For me, what I want to start with is that both players have admitted in interviews that kind of thing, although we don't always see like arguments like that on court, but it's something that is just purely something that happens on court. It's just a situation that happens in the match, and it happens. Players want to win, emotions can run high, and obviously sometimes it can spill over a little bit, but both players don't hold anything against it. It's just something, I think Xiuqi said it's something normal for a match. Viktor said, yeah, no, it's just, That's just, we both really want to win, and sometimes it spills over. Off court, we've got no issue with each other. So I think it's really important to clarify that I don't think this is going to affect their relationship off the court. I don't know whether they have one, but I know obviously Viktor speaks Mandarin, so they've probably exchanged words and spoken to each other, and I'm sure they're not going to start hating each other and avoiding each other in the hallway and all that kind of stuff because of one little situation in the match. In terms of my thoughts on it, I just thought it was rather unnecessary. From kind of both players, I understand Shiuchi's frustration that, deeming it should be a fault, so maybe he's every right to just kind of have a quick word. But again, we always have the umpire going, you can't go up to the service judge and ask them and talk this stuff. There's something that you're not necessarily supposed to do. For me, I think Axelsen coming over and getting kind of in Chi-Chi's face in that respect, again, unnecessary. For me, the way I saw it was, if I was Viktor, again, it's easy to say this because when you're in the heat of the moment and it's a competitive match and there's a lot on the line, you really want to do well, especially Viktor, who's in front of his home crowd, his hometown, and this is his first tournament back. He really wants to do well. It's just gone to 3. You got to kind of put yourself in those shoes. You can't always control your emotions like 100% perfectly. I don't think we should hold people to those saint-like standards. But the way I saw it was, okay, Shiichi's going to the service judge. Clearly, he's a little bit flustered by this. I've got the upper hand, so let's just stay calm. Let him talk. Let him talk. If the service judge starts calling, the umpire starts calling me, then we need to kind of go with that situation. But I think he could have just gone, right, okay, let's hold it in. He's clearly rattled. I've got the upper hand, and go from there. And because Viktor's quite an emotional person, and actually I think the reason he actually inevitably lost that third game is that situation got to him and he ended up having a really bad start. So I think getting involved like that didn't do him any good. It got his emotions too high and he wasn't able to control it, and it kind of got away from him. So for me, like I said, I felt it was rather unnecessary, a little petty. But again, in these situations, like both players admitted, this is the kind of thing that can happen in a competitive match, especially a semi-final of a Super 750, etc. I just don't necessarily agree with people painting Viktor as an unsportsmanlike person or suddenly calling him out for disgusting behaviour. I wouldn't go that far. I would simply rule it as unnecessary. In terms of the serve itself, this is the last thing I'll say, is I know the new rule is all about undue delay. There's actually no technical rule about doing that because it's all about one motion with the serve. Okay? For me, I think the stop clock is going to put an end to it. Obviously, umpires should be calling this and all that stuff, but it's a little bit subjective. With the stop clock, if Viktor does that and he hasn't served and his time's gone, obviously then it's a clear fault. That adds more objectivity to the situation. I think it's going to help the umpires, and obviously it's going to be a good thing for players. And there's an objective thing they got to abide by. At the moment, the ruling, although it's there technically, it's far too subjective, and it obviously comes down to how the umpires are going to call it. I think that's all I can really say on that. So I think I'll end there and say thank you for watching. As always, especially on that last situation, I know it's been quite controversial. Please feel free to add your comments in the comment section below. Obviously, add your comments on everything that I spoke about in this video. I do apologise for the slightly late upload. I was away in France with my wife at the weekend, so obviously that pushed things back. But I'll be back to normal next week for another Super 750 in France, the French Open, a tournament I absolutely love watching. I think it's always produced really, really well. So until that video, guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.